They whispered I was walking into the den of a beast, a savage king who slaughtered his tribute brides beneath the winter moon. I wore white silk to hide the silver blades strapped to my thighs. They thought I was a sacrifice. They didn't know I was the executioner. The carriage rattled violently over the frozen tundra, the iron-wrought wheels protesting against the jagged ice of the northern wastes. Inside, Genevieve Sterling sat as still as a corpse. Her wedding gown, a cascade of pure white silk and heavy velvet, felt more like a burial shroud. Around her wrists, concealed beneath long lace sleeves, were cuffs of cold iron, a stark reminder of her status. She was not a bride making a joyous journey to her groom. She was a blood price. For centuries, the southern Pax and the northern wastes had been divided by the jagged peaks of the Bloodstone Mountains. But the fragile peace, established by the Treaty of St. Jude, had been shattered 3 years ago when the Southern Alphas, led by Genevieve's uncle, Silas Sterling, attempted an uprising. The rebellion had been crushed ruthlessly by the North's new ruler, Cailan Vane, the Alpha King. Rumors of King Cailan had bled into the south long before his armies did. They called him the Wolf of Winter, a monstrous brute whose wolf form was said to be the size of a warhorse. Tales whispered in the dark corners of southern taverns claimed he drank the blood of his enemies from silver goblets, and that his previous 3 brides, all political hostages like Genevieve, had disappeared on their wedding nights, leaving behind nothing but shredded silk and blood-stained bedchambers. "We are 10 minutes from the outer gates, my lady," the muffled voice of the carriage driver called out through the small wooden partition. Genevieve did not reply. She simply lowered her head, closing her eyes to focus on the rhythmic beating of her heart. "Slow it down," she commanded herself. A racing heart reeks of fear to a wolf. She shifted her weight, feeling the reassuring press of cold metal against her right thigh. Strapped there, invisible beneath the voluminous layers of her skirts, was a slender dagger forged from pure meteoric silver, its edge coated in a lethal dose of concentrated wolfsbane and weeping ash. Her uncle Silas had handed it to her himself on the night she was selected as the tribute. "You are a Sterling," Silas had told her, his grip bruising her shoulder. "Cailan Vane destroyed our armies, but he is still a man, subject to the arrogant lusts of men. When you are alone in his chambers, when he drops his guard to claim his prize, you will strike. Sever the beast's head, Genevieve, and the North will fracture. You will be the savior of our people." What Silas didn't know, what no one in the South knew, was that Genevieve didn't care about saving the Sterling legacy. Her uncle had orchestrated the deaths of her parents to seize control of the pack when she was just a child. He had raised her not as a niece, but as a weapon, honing her combat skills in the shadows while keeping her locked away from the pack's politics. She was undertaking this suicide mission for one reason only. Silas held her younger brother, Leo, hostage. If Genevieve killed the Alpha King, Leo lived. If she failed, Leo would be executed for treason. The carriage jolted to a sudden, violent halt. The blare of a massive war horn echoed through the freezing air, vibrating against the wooden walls of the coach. The heavy door was wrenched open, letting in a blast of sub-zero wind that smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and raw meat. 2 towering guards clad in dark furs and iron armor reached in, their amber eyes glowing unnaturally in the twilight. Without a word, they hauled her out into the snow. Genevieve blinked against the biting wind, looking up at Castle Blackwood. It wasn't a palace. It was a fortress of jagged obsidian stone carved directly into the side of a mountain. Torches sputtered violently in the courtyard, casting long, dancing shadows across the ranks of northern warriors lined up to witness the arrival of the king's new meat. And there, standing at the top of the frozen stone steps, was Cailan Vane. He was a terrifying monument of a man. Broad-shouldered and impossibly tall, he wore a mantle of black wolf fur over scarred leather armor. His hair was as dark as the castle stone, falling past his shoulders in savage waves. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Genevieve's lungs. They were a piercing, glacial blue, strikingly cold and unblinking. A jagged, faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, trailing down to his jawline, a brutal testament to a lifetime of war. As Genevieve was shoved forward by her guards, she forced herself to meet his gaze. She expected to see hunger. She expected to see cruelty or the sadistic glee of a conqueror claiming his spoils. Instead, as Kaelin looked down at her small, trembling form, she saw nothing but a calculating, profound emptiness. "The Southern Tribute," Kaelin's voice resonated over the courtyard, a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Genevieve's bones. "You look fragile." "Steel is often forged thin, Your Grace," Genevieve shot back, the words leaving her lips before she could stop them. A ripple of low growls echoed through the assembled northern warriors at her insolence. But Kaelin simply raised a hand, and silence fell instantly. For the briefest fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched. "We shall see," he murmured. "Bring the priest. We bind the blood tonight." The binding ceremony was entirely devoid of romance. There were no vows of love, no golden rings, and no celebrations. In the freezing stone hollow of the castle's sanctum, an ancient blind priest sliced the palms of both Kaelin and Genevieve with a ceremonial bone knife. He pressed their bleeding hands together, binding them with a leather strap soaked in ash, and chanted an oath of allegiance to the earth and the moon. Throughout the ordeal, Kaelin's grip was suffocatingly tight, his skin radiating a supernatural heat that contrasted sharply with Genevieve's shivering frame. She could smell his scent up close now. Petrichor, old blood, and a sharp, metallic tang that made her instincts scream. When the leather strap was untied, it was done. She was Queen of the North, and she was marked for death. Less than an hour later, the heavy oak doors of the king's private bedchamber slammed shut, the iron lock clicking loudly into place from the outside. Genevieve stood frozen in the center of the massive room. The chamber was surprisingly bare, dominated by a massive four-poster bed covered in dark furs and a roaring hearth that cast dancing orange light across the stone walls. Kaelin walked past her without a word, shedding his heavy fur mantle and tossing it onto a chair. Underneath, he wore only a simple linen tunic, his broad back shifting with powerful, fluid muscle beneath the fabric. He moved to a wooden side table, pouring himself a measure of dark amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "You may drop the terrified virgin act," Kaelin said, his back still turned to her. He raised the glass to his lips, taking a slow sip. "It is insulting to both our intelligences." Genevieve's blood turned to ice. She didn't speak. Slowly, silently, she reached down through the slit in her white silk skirt, her fingers wrapping around the hilt of the silver dagger. "I can hear your heart rate, Genevieve of House Sterling," Kaelin continued, his voice terrifyingly calm. "It was beating like a trapped rabbit's when you stepped out of the carriage, but the moment those doors locked, it settled. It became steady. Deliberate." He slowly turned to face her, leaning back against the wooden table. "That is not the heartbeat of a terrified bride. That is the heartbeat of an assassin calculating her strike." Genevieve didn't hesitate. In a blur of white silk and lethal grace, she lunged. She covered the distance between them in two massive strides, drawing the poisoned silver blade and thrusting it directly toward the pulse point at Kaelin's throat. But Kaelin was an Alpha King for a reason. He didn't even drop his glass. With blinding speed, his free hand shot up, his thick fingers wrapping around her wrist like a vice. Genevieve gasped as the bones in her arm ground together. The tip of her silver blade halted a mere millimeter from his neck. A single drop of weeping ash poison dripped from the metal, sizzling as it hit the stone floor. They stood locked together, Kaylin's glacial blue eyes staring down into her fierce, terrified brown ones. "Silver and weeping ash," Kaylin observed mildly, glancing at the blade. "Silas spared no expense, but your footwork was sloppy. You telegraphed the lunge." "Let me go," Genevieve hissed, trying to twist her wrist free, but his grip was immovable. She brought her knee up, aiming for his groin, but he simply shifted his hips, blocking the blow with his armored thigh. "I don't think I will," Kaylin said softly. He squeezed her wrist just hard enough to force her fingers open. The silver dagger clattered harmlessly to the floor. With a swift tug, he spun her around, pinning her back against his broad chest and locking both her arms behind her. "Listen to me very carefully, little bird," Kaylin whispered, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. "If I wanted you dead, your neck would already be snapped. But I don't want you dead, because I know exactly why you are here, and I know exactly who sent you." Genevieve stopped struggling, panting heavily. "Everyone knows who sent me. Silas sent me as a peace offering." "Silas sent you as a match to light a powder keg," Kaylin corrected, his voice hardening into a low rumble. "Tell me, Genevieve, what was his grand plan? You murder me in my bed, and then what? Do you honestly think my generals would just let you walk out the front gates? They would tear you to shreds before the sun rose." I know that," Genevieve gritted out. "It's a suicide mission." Kaylin released her suddenly, stepping back. Genevieve stumbled forward, catching herself on the edge of the bed and whirling around to face him, rubbing her bruised wrist. "Then why do it?" Kaylin asked, his brow furrowing in genuine curiosity. "Why throw your life away for an uncle who clearly sees you as nothing more than disposable fodder?" "Because he has my brother!" Genevieve screamed, the desperate secret finally tearing its way out of her throat. Tears of frustration and terror pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Silas has Leo locked in the dungeons of Highreach. If I don't kill you tonight, he'll execute him tomorrow at dawn." Kaylin stared at her in silence for a long, agonizing moment. The only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Finally, the Alpha King let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his dark hair. He bent down, picked up her poisoned silver dagger by the hilt, and casually tossed it onto the bed next to her. Genevieve flinched, staring at the weapon. "What are you doing?" "Proving a point," Kaylin said, walking over to a massive map spread across a grand oak table near the window. "Your Uncle Silas is a fool, Genevieve, but he is a dangerous, ambitious fool. You think he wants me dead to free the South? He wants me dead so he can blame the assassination on a rogue faction of his own people, declare martial law, and crown himself the supreme High Alpha of the Southern Territories." Kaylin tapped a clawed finger against a red marker on the map, the location of Highreach, Silas's stronghold. 3 weeks ago, Kaylin continued, his tone turning deadly serious, "my spies intercepted a caravan of arms heading toward Highreach. Not standard steel, black iron, wolf-killing weapons. Silas isn't preparing for peace, he's preparing for an extermination, and he needed me distracted. He needed me dead, or at least occupied with avenging my own murder, so my armies wouldn't march south until it was too late." Genevieve stared at him, her mind reeling. "But the rumors. My uncle said you slaughtered your previous brides." "Did I?" Kaylin chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He walked over to a heavy iron-bound chest at the foot of his bed, unlocked it, and pulled out a stack of parchment. He tossed them onto the table. "Read them." Genevieve cautiously approached the table. The parchments were letters, sealed with the crests of 3 different prominent northern houses. "Thank you, my king, for granting our daughter safe passage to the eastern ports. She has boarded the merchant vessel and is safely away from her abusive father. We are forever in your debt for faking Lady Clara's death." The southern spies remain convinced you devoured her, and she is now living freely under a new name in Oakhaven. Genevieve's breath hitched. You didn't kill them. I am a king, Genevieve, not a monster, Cailan said softly, his blue eyes meeting hers. Those girls were sent here as sacrifices by cowards who didn't want to fight me themselves. I smuggled them out of the kingdom and staged their deaths to keep their families from coming after them. Genevieve slumped into a heavy wooden chair, her perfectly constructed worldview crumbling into ash. So I'm just another fake death. You're going to smuggle me out, too? She looked up, panic seizing her chest. I can't. If I disappear, Silas will know I failed. He will kill Leo. Cailan stepped closer, leaning over the table, until his face was inches from hers. The scent of him was overwhelming now, powerful and intoxicating. I am not going to smuggle you out, Genevieve, Cailan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, conspiratorial whisper. Because unlike the others, you are not a frightened victim. You are a trained killer with a vendetta against the man I am about to go to war with. He extended a massive, calloused hand toward her. Silas expects news of my death by morning, Cailan said, a feral, predatory smile slowly spreading across his scarred face. Let's give him a different kind of news. Let's send word that the blood bride of the North has tamed the beast, and that she stands at his side as an equal. We will march on Highreach together, Genevieve. I will get your brother back, and in exchange, you will help me tear your uncle's empire down from the inside. Genevieve looked at his outstretched hand, the hand of the cruel Alpha King, the monster she had been sent to kill. Slowly, she reached out and placed her palm against his. By dawn, a single black raven was flying south over the jagged peaks of the Bloodstone Mountains. Tied to its leg was a parchment, sealed with the dire wolf crest of the North, written in Genevieve's elegant, sweeping hand. The message was brief, a calculated masterpiece of deception. The beast is bewitched. He marches south to offer terms of submission, blinded by his new queen. Prepare the gates. There was no carriage for the return journey. Genevieve rode a massive, charcoal-grey warhorse, flanked by Cailan and a vanguard of his most elite northern guard. The biting wind of the tundra whipped at her cloak, but she no longer felt the bone-deep chill that had paralyzed her upon her arrival. The heavy iron cuffs had been struck from her wrists. In their place, Cailan had gifted her a pair of exquisite leather gauntlets lined with sable, and a belt studded with hidden sheaths for her throwing knives. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a captive, a pawn, or a sacrificial lamb. She felt like a commander. The journey through the treacherous mountain pass took a grueling 5 days. It was during these freezing, star-swept nights around the campfire that the icy barrier between the Alpha King and the Southern Assassin began to truly melt. They plotted Silas's downfall not as master and servant, but as equals. One evening, as the fire snapped and hissed against the encroaching dark, Cailan tossed a sparring blade into the snow at Genevieve's boots. Your uncle taught you how to strike from the shadows, Cailan rumbled, rolling his broad shoulders beneath his fur mantle. But if our ruse fails at Highreach, you will be fighting in the bloody chaos of a melee. Pick it up. Show me how you defend your center. Genevieve snatched the hilt, her muscles coiling. She lunged, aiming a feint at his ribs before twisting to strike at his throat. Cailan moved with impossible, liquid speed. He didn't just block her, he stepped into a guard, catching her forearm and sweeping her legs out from under her in one seamless motion. Genevieve hit the snow hard, gasping as Cailan's heavy body followed, pinning her down. His forearm pressed gently but firmly against her collarbone, his glacial blue eyes burning into hers. You overcommit, he murmured, his breath a hot cloud pluming in the freezing air. The scent of him, pine, smoke, and primal power was intoxicatingly close. You fight like someone who expects to die, Genevieve. You must fight like someone who demands to live. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it wasn't from fear. It was a chaotic, thrilling heat that pooled in her stomach. She stared up into his scarred face, realizing that the monster the South feared so deeply was the only man who had ever wanted her to survive. Slowly, deliberately, she reached up, her gloved fingers tracing the jagged scar that cut across his eyebrow. Kalen froze, his chest rumbling with a sound that was half sigh, half growl, before he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was like the North itself, wild, consuming, and fiercely uncompromising. Genevieve surrendered to it, her hands tangling in his dark hair, a silent pact forged in the snow that ran far deeper than any blood oath. On the morning of the 6th day, the sprawling fortress of High Reach loomed on the horizon. Built from pale limestone, it looked like a bleached skull resting in the valley. The massive iron gates groaned open as Kalen's vanguard approached. Banners of the Sterling House snapped in the wind, and a phalanx of southern guards lined the courtyard, their hands resting menacingly on the hilts of their swords. At the top of the courtyard stairs stood Silas. He wore robes of crimson and gold, a smug, triumphant smile twisting his sharp features. He looked past Kalen, his eyes locking on to Genevieve. "My beloved niece," Silas called out, his voice dripping with false warmth. "You have done the impossible. You have brought the Wolf of Winter to our doorstep, tamed and collared." "I brought him to negotiate, Uncle," Genevieve replied, her voice ringing out, clear and cold. "Negotiate?" Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He snapped his fingers. Instantly, the atmosphere shattered. But the betrayal did not come from the southern guards. It came from behind. Genevieve heard the sickening sound of a blade biting into flesh. She whirled around to see Commander Corrin, Kalen's most trusted bannerman, pulling a bloodied sword from the back of a northern guard. Within seconds, half of Kalen's vanguard drew their weapons, turning them not on the southern army, but on their own king. "Did you truly think I would rely entirely on a little girl with a dagger?" Silas mocked, stepping down the stairs. "Gold buys far more loyalty than a crown," Kalen vain. Corrin here was quite eager to ensure the northern wastes would have a more cooperative ruler once you were out of the way. Kalen stood dead center in the trap, surrounded by traitors and enemies, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "You are a fool, Silas." "I am the High Alpha of the United Pax," Silas roared, his eyes flashing yellow. He gestured to the heavy wooden doors of the keep. "Bring out the boy." 2 guards dragged a figure out into the freezing light. Genevieve's breath left her in a ragged gasp. It was Leo. He was bruised, malnourished, and bound in heavy chains forged of black iron. "Drop your weapons," Silas commanded, drawing his own broadsword and resting the edge against Leo's throat, "or the boy's head rolls down these steps before you can even blink." Genevieve's hands trembled, hovering over her hidden knives. The trap had closed, the Alpha King was cornered, and her brother was seconds away from death. "Genevieve!" Silas barked, his eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. "Come stand beside your true Alpha. You did your job. Now watch the beast die." Genevieve looked at Kalen. His blue eyes met hers, and in that split second, a silent, telepathic command passed between them. "Fight like someone who demands to live." She slowly raised her hands, stepping away from Kalen and moving toward the stairs. "You promised he would be safe, Silas," she said, her voice shaking, feigning a perfect picture of submission. "He will be." Silas smiled, his attention wavering from his hostage to revel in his niece's surrender. "Once Vane's head is on a pike." Genevieve stopped 5 paces from Corrin, the traitorous northern commander. With a sob, she dropped to her knees. Corrin smirked, lowering his guard. It was the last mistake he ever made. Genevieve's hand shot to her boot. In a blur of motion, she hurled a throwing knife. It buried itself to the hilt in Corin's throat. The traitor gurgled, dropping his sword and collapsing to the cobblestones. Chaos erupted. Cailan didn't draw his sword. He threw his head back and let out a roar that shattered the very air. The sound was so concussive, so terrifyingly loud, that the nearest guards dropped to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. In a horrific symphony of snapping bones and tearing fabric, Cailan shifted. The legends of the South were wrong. He wasn't the size of a war horse. He was bigger. A monstrous, towering wolf of pitch-black fur and glowing, glacial blue eyes stood in the courtyard. The beast lunged forward with explosive speed, its jaws clamping down on the closest southern guard, throwing the armored man across the courtyard like a rag doll. The sheer brutality of the Alpha King in his true form paralyzed the courtyard in terror. "Kill the boy!" Silas shrieked in panic, shoving Leo forward and raising his broadsword to strike the killing blow himself. "Leo, down!" Genevieve screamed. The boy collapsed to his knees, just as Genevieve closed the distance. She didn't bother with her throwing knives. She drew the meteoric silver dagger, the very weapon Silas had given her to murder Cailan. Silas swung his heavy sword at her, but Genevieve remembered Cailan's training. She didn't block the massive weapon. She ducked beneath the arc, letting the momentum carry her uncle forward, exposing his flank. She drove the silver dagger deep between Silas's ribs, twisting the hilt. Silas gasped, his eyes going wide as the weeping ash poison immediately began to scorch through his veins. He dropped his sword, clutching at Genevieve's arms. "I am a Sterling," Genevieve whispered furiously into his ear, watching the light fade from the tyrant's eyes. "You made me a weapon, uncle, but you forgot to point me in the right direction." She ripped the dagger out, and Silas crumpled to the stone steps, dead before he finished bleeding. Below them, the battle had ceased. The courtyard was painted crimson, but Cailan's loyal guards had rallied behind the devastating power of the Alpha Beast, disarming the surviving traitors and southern soldiers. The colossal black wolf stood panting in the center of the carnage, his muzzle stained red. He looked up at the stairs, his massive chest heaving. Genevieve fell to her knees beside Leo, frantically using the silver dagger to pick the locks of his iron chains. "Leo, I've got you. I've got you," she sobbed, pulling her little brother into a desperate embrace. Leo clung to her, burying his face in her cloak, crying silently. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed on the stone stairs. Genevieve looked up. Cailan had shifted back. He was naked from the waist up, covered in the blood of his enemies, his chest rising and falling heavily. He walked up the steps, ignoring the terrified gasps of the remaining southern nobles who had crept out of the keep to witness the fall of their high alpha. Cailan stopped in front of Genevieve and Leo. He didn't look like a conqueror claiming his prize. He looked like a man who had just torn the world apart to ensure she was safe. He dropped to one knee, a gesture of respect that sent shock waves through the watching crowd, and offered Genevieve his hand. "The South is without an alpha," Cailan's deep voice resonated, carrying across the silent, bloody courtyard. "But they are not without a queen." Genevieve looked at her brother, who nodded weakly, but managed a small, brave smile. She wiped the tears from her face, stood tall, and placed her hand in Cailan's. As he pulled her up, wrapping a protective arm around her waist, the surviving southern guards and the northern warriors fell to their knees in unison. She had been sold to a cruel king to be broken. Instead, she had found her equal, her vengeance, and her crown. Did Genevieve's brutal journey from a sacrificial lamb to the savage queen of the north leave you completely breathless? If you loved this epic tale of dark betrayal, dangerous romance, and bloody revenge, don't let the adventure end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling werewolf dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have trusted the Alpha King?